It was a cool afternoon in downtown Los Angeles. The streets buzzed with the usual noise of traffic, honking cars and people rushing by without looking up from their phones. Among them walked Steven Seagal, dressed in his usual black jacket, dark sunglasses, and jeans, blending into the crowd more than anyone expected. He had just finished lunch at a small corner diner. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where he could enjoy a meal without the flash of cameras or the noise of fame. But as he stepped out heading toward his car parked across the street, a quiet voice stopped him. "Sir, could you spare $1 for some food?" The voice came from a man sitting on the sidewalk near the diner's entrance. His clothes were worn, his hair unwashed, and his eyes hollow from exhaustion. He clutched a small cardboard sign that simply read, "Hungry. Please help." Steven paused. Most people would have walked past pretending not to hear, but not him. He turned, his calm eyes meeting the man's. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The man didn't even realize who he was talking to. A couple sitting nearby whispered, "Is that Steven Seagal?" Another replied softly, "No way, he wouldn't stop for a homeless guy." But he did. Steven walked closer, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement. The man looked nervous now, almost regretting asking. I just need $1, he said again, voice shaking. "Anything helps." Instead of reaching for his wallet, Steven crouched down so he could look the man in the eye. The simple gesture drew curious stares from everyone around. "What's your name, brother?" he asked calmly. The man blinked in surprise. "David," he replied quietly. Steven nodded slowly, studying his face with the same focus he once used in front of opponents in the ring. Then, after a brief silence, he said something that made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing. "David, maybe today you don't just need $1. Maybe you need someone to listen." But what Steven did next left everyone completely speechless. For a moment, the street went silent. Even the passing cars seemed to fade into the background. Steven Seagal, a man known around the world for his strength and action, now sat on the sidewalk beside a homeless man named David. No cameras, no red carpet. Just two human beings sharing a moment most people would never even notice. Steven leaned slightly forward, resting his arms on his knees. "David, how long have you been out here?" he asked softly. David looked down at the cracked pavement. "Too long," he muttered. "Almost 3 years now." 3 years? Steven repeated quietly, as if letting the weight of those words sink in. "How does a man end up out here?" David gave a bitter laugh, the kind that's more pain than humor. "One bad turn, I guess. Lost my job after an accident. Couldn't pay rent. Then it all just fell apart." He hesitated, glancing at Steven as if expecting judgment. But Steven just nodded, listening closely. "Did you try finding work again?" Steven asked. "I did," David said. "But once you look like this," he gestured to his torn jacket and dirty hands, "nobody gives you a chance." Steven sighed quietly. Sometimes people forget that life can flip for anyone, anytime. By now, a small crowd had gathered. A few people had their phones out, pretending to scroll but secretly recording. Others whispered, "Is that really Steven Seagal sitting on the sidewalk?" One woman nearby said softly, "I've seen celebrities walk right past people like him. But this is different." Steven turned slightly, his calm voice steady as ever. "You know something, David," he said. "People think strength is about fighting or winning. But real strength is when you don't let the world break your spirit." David smiled faintly, a hint of light returning to his eyes. "Hard to stay strong when nobody sees you," he said. Steven nodded slowly. Then maybe today someone finally does. He reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out cash, he placed his phone on the ground next to him. "Money can help you for a day," Steven said. "But I want to know what would help you for good." David's lips trembled. "I just want to feel human again. To have a bed, a job, something that reminds me I'm not forgotten." Steven sat quietly for a few seconds, then stood up. "Wait here, David," he said. David looked panicked. "Please, I didn't mean to bother you." Steven raised a hand gently. "You didn't, just stay here." He walked back into the diner. The onlookers exchanged confused looks, some assuming he had left for good. "Told you," a man muttered, "they always walk away." But within minutes, Steven came back out, not with $1, not even with cash, but with 2 large paper bags filled with food, sandwiches, and bottled water. He sat back down beside David, opened one bag, and handed it to him. "Eat with me," he said simply. David blinked. With you? Steven smiled. You asked for $1. I figured we could start with lunch. The crowd went quiet again. Some people lowered their phones, realizing this wasn't just a celebrity moment. This was real kindness. David hesitated at first, then slowly opened the bag and began to eat. His hands shook, but the relief on his face said more than words ever could. Steven sat beside him, eating calmly as if this was the most natural thing in the world. A little girl walking with her mother tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, he's eating with the homeless man." Her mother smiled softly. "Yes, sweetie. That's called kindness." Steven looked at David and said quietly, "You know, people measure success by money, houses, or fame. But the truth is, success means nothing if you forget how to care." David swallowed hard, tears forming in his eyes. "I didn't think anyone cared anymore." Steven nodded. "They do. Sometimes they just need to be reminded." A man in the crowd called out, "Hey, Seagal, that's a real hero move, man." Steven just smiled faintly. "No heroes here," he replied. "Just two people sharing a meal." The moment touched everyone watching. You could almost feel the change in the air, the quiet respect, the realization that compassion still existed. Have you ever met someone who surprised you with their kindness? Tell me in the comments, and also write your country and city below. I'd love to know where you're watching this from. The two men sat side by side on that cold sidewalk, the smell of coffee and street food lingering in the air. People walked past pretending not to stare, but almost everyone slowed down just to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Steven Seagal, a man known for his powerful presence, his calm authority, was sharing a quiet lunch with a man the world had forgotten. No spotlight, no cameras, just humanity. David took another bite of his sandwich, eating slowly, as if savoring every moment. Between bites, he whispered, "You don't have to do this, you know. I'm used to people walking away." Steven leaned back slightly, his voice calm. "Maybe that's the problem, David. Too many people walk away." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise returned, the sound of engines, footsteps, laughter from across the street. But in that small circle on the sidewalk, it felt like a different world. Finally, David looked up. "I used to have a family," he said softly. "A wife, a little girl. She'd be 12 now." Steven turned his head slightly. "What happened?" David took a deep breath, his eyes glistening. "After the accident, I couldn't work. I was a mechanic, good one too. But once the bills started piling up, my wife couldn't handle it. She left, took our daughter with her. I tried to get clean to start over, but every door shut in my face. Eventually, I just stopped knocking." Steven listened quietly, his eyes steady and compassionate. "Life can be cruel," he said, "but it only beats you if you stop fighting." David gave a weak laugh. "You sound like someone who's never fallen." Steven smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised, my friend. Everyone falls. The only difference is, and some of us get back up." The sincerity in his tone hit David harder than any motivational speech ever could. He nodded slowly, his eyes watering. "I used to believe that," he whispered. "Now I just exist." Steven took a sip from his coffee cup, then said, "Existing isn't living. You've still got fight left in you." "I can see it," David shook his head. "You don't even know me." Steven leaned closer. "I don't have to. I can see it in your eyes. You're tired, but you're not broken. That means you're still standing, and that's half the battle." The words hung in the air. A small crowd had gathered again, but this time they weren't whispering or recording. They were listening. The moment felt sacred. David rubbed his eyes with his sleeve. "Why are you doing this, man?" "You don't owe me anything." Steven smiled softly. "Maybe not. But if we only helped people we owed, the world would be a pretty cold place, don't you think?" David chuckled through his tears. "You really talk like one of those wise monks in your movies." Steven laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Maybe that's where I learned it. But the truth is simple, David. Kindness is free, and it's the only thing that doubles every time you give it away." David looked down at the ground, his voice trembling. "You know, nobody's called me by my name in weeks. Everyone just says hey or ignores me." Steven's expression softened even more. "Names matter," he said. "They remind us that we exist, that we're human." The conversation continued for several minutes, shifting between silence and small talk. The wind picked up, tugging at Steven's jacket, but he didn't move. He stayed right there beside David, as if time itself didn't matter. Finally, Steven reached into his jacket pocket. "Tell you what," he said. "Tomorrow I want you to meet me right here. Same spot." David frowned. "Why? You've already done enough." Steven smiled. "Let's just say I have a plan." David hesitated. "A plan?" "Yeah," Steven said, standing up. "Something that might help you get your life back." The words hit David like lightning. Hope, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, and flickered inside him again. "You're serious?" he asked. "Dead serious," Steven replied, offering his hand. "Tomorrow at noon." "Don't be late." David slowly reached out, shaking his hand. His grip was weak but full of gratitude. "I'll be here," he promised. Steven nodded once, then turned and began walking toward his car. People watched silently, the way you do when you realize you've just witnessed something rare. David looked down at the half-eaten sandwich in his hands, then up at the street where Steven disappeared. For the first time in years, he smiled, not because of the food or the money, but because someone had finally seen him. That night, as he lay beneath the overpass with his worn blanket, David whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow will be different." He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be different, because Steven Seagal wasn't done changing his life. If you were in Steven's place, would you have stopped and talked or just walked away like most people? Type your honest answer in the comments below. The next day, the city woke to a crisp morning breeze. People hurried through their routines, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, unaware that something extraordinary was about to happen on a small, forgotten corner of the street. David was already there, sitting on the same spot as yesterday. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept replaying Steven's words. "Tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." He clutched the worn blanket around his shoulders, glancing down the road every few minutes. For years, people had made promises and broken them, but for some reason, this one felt different. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the doubt. What if it was just pity? What if he doesn't come? By noon, David's hope began to waver. He looked at the people passing by, the same indifferent faces as always. His heart sank a little deeper. Just when he started to stand up to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. Deep, powerful, and smooth. A black SUV pulled up beside the sidewalk. The door opened, and out stepped Steven Seagal, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses. Heads turned immediately. Passers-by slowed down, whispering in disbelief. David froze. "You came," he whispered. Steven smiled warmly. "Told you I would, didn't I?" David grinned, a rare, genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. "Yeah, I just didn't think you'd actually remember." Steven chuckled softly. "I don't make promises I can't keep." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a medium-sized duffel bag. "Come on," he said. "Walk with me." David hesitated. "Where to?" Steven turned slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Just trust me." They started walking down the street together, one man in tattered clothes, the other in polished boots. The contrast was striking, yet there was no judgment in Steven's eyes, only purpose. As they walked, people began recognizing him. A few whispered, "That's Steven Seagal," while others discreetly recorded on their phones. David kept his head low, feeling embarrassed. "They're staring," he muttered. "Let them," Steven said without breaking stride. "Maybe they'll learn something." A few blocks later, they arrived at a small barber shop. The place looked simple but clean. Steven pushed open the door. "After you," he said. Inside, the air smelled of shaving cream and fresh towels. The barber, an older man with kind eyes, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Seagal." "What a pleasure." Steven nodded. "Hey, Tony, think you can help my friend out here?" Tony smiled at David. "Of course. Have a seat, my friend." David sat hesitantly in the chair. For the first time in years, someone draped a clean cape over his shoulders. Steven leaned against the counter, watching quietly as Tony got to work. The razor buzzed softly. Tufts of messy hair fell to the floor. Bit by bit, David's worn, rugged face began to re-emerge. Cleaner, sharper, more human. When Tony was done, he spun the chair around to face the mirror. David stared at his reflection, speechless. The man looking back wasn't the same one who had asked for $1 yesterday. He looked alive again. I don't recognize myself," David murmured. Steven smiled. Maybe that's the point. After paying Tony generously, Steven handed David a small shopping bag. "Clothes," he said simply. "There's a restroom in the back, and go change." David hesitated again. You really didn't have to do all this. Steven looked him dead in the eyes. Yes, I did. Everyone deserves a fresh start, even if it's just a haircut and a clean shirt. Minutes later, David stepped out wearing a new pair of jeans, a clean white t-shirt, and a light jacket. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a homeless man. He looked like someone with a story. When they walked back outside, the small crowd that had gathered began to clap. Someone even shouted, "He looks like a new man." David's cheeks flushed. "I don't deserve this," he said under his breath. Steven put a hand on his shoulder. "You deserve a chance, that's all." They walked back toward the SUV and Steven handed him the duffel bag. "There's something inside for you," he said. David unzipped it slowly. Inside were basic essentials: shoes, toiletries, and a small envelope. He opened it and froze. Inside was a stack of bills, not just a few dollars, but enough to change his situation completely. His hands trembled. "Steven, this is too much." "I can't take this," Steven shook his head. "You're not taking it. You're earning it, by promising me one thing." David swallowed hard. "What's that?" "Tomorrow," Steven said, "you're going to walk into that job center across the street and ask for work. You're not going to give up again. Deal?" David's eyes filled with tears. "Deal," he whispered. Steven nodded once, his voice steady. "Good. Then my job here is done." David tried to speak but couldn't. Emotion overwhelmed him. He stepped forward and hugged Steven tightly. For a man who'd lost everything, that simple act of kindness meant more than gold. As Steven stepped into his car and started the engine, David stood on the curb, watching him drive away. He held the duffel bag close to his chest, tears rolling down his face. But this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of hope. The cameras had caught everything. Within hours, clips began spreading online. The Hollywood star who stopped for a homeless man and gave him a second chance. And yet Steven didn't post a single thing about it. Not a word. To him, it wasn't a performance. It was simply the right thing to do. But what happened the next day, when David walked into that job center, was something even Steven Seagal couldn't have predicted. The sun rose brighter the next morning, painting the city in shades of gold. David sat up from his makeshift bed under the overpass, clutching the duffel bag to his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He pulled on his clean jacket, looked into a broken mirror by the wall, and took a deep breath. "Today's the day," he whispered to himself. Across the street, just like Steven said, was the city's job assistance center, a place David had walked past hundreds of times but never dared to enter. His palms were sweating, his stomach knotted with nerves, but Steven's words echoed in his mind. "You're not taking it. You're earning it, by not giving up." So David stepped forward. When he entered, the receptionist looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning. How can we help you today?" For a moment, David froze. He wasn't used to being addressed kindly. I'm looking for work," he stammered. "Do you have any experience?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I used to be a mechanic." Her eyes lit up. "You're in luck. A local garage just listed an opening this morning." She handed him a form. "Fill this out and I'll schedule an interview." David's hands trembled as he wrote. His handwriting was shaky, but every letter felt like a victory. When he handed the paper back, the receptionist smiled. "Your interview's at 2 p.m. today. You've got this." He stepped outside, his heart pounding. "I've got this," he repeated softly. As he waited for the hours to pass, David walked around the city. The world looked different, brighter, more alive. He passed the same spots he used to beg for money, the same people who once ignored him. But now something had changed. He had changed. When 2 p.m. came, David walked into the garage, shoulders back and chin high. The shop smelled of oil and metal, familiar, comforting scents. The owner, a middle-aged man named Carl, greeted him with a handshake. "You must be David," he said. "Come on, let's talk." For half an hour, David told him about his past work, the engines he'd fixed, the long nights, the pride he once felt. Carl listened carefully. When they finished, he said, "You've got the skills, that's clear. You can start tomorrow if you're serious." David's eyes widened. "You mean it?" Carl smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Don't waste it." David shook his hand firmly. I won't. As he walked out of the shop, the afternoon sun hit his face. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Steven." But little did he know, Steven was already watching from a distance. Across the street, Steven sat quietly in his SUV, observing everything. He saw the way David walked out of the garage, confident, alive, transformed. Steven smiled to himself. He did it, he murmured. He could have left then, satisfied that his part was done. But as he started the car, a small group of people approached. A few had seen yesterday's viral video and recognized him instantly. "Hey, you're the guy who helped that homeless man, right?" one of them said, holding up a phone. Steven sighed softly. "I'm just a man who stopped to listen," he replied. The young woman recording lowered her phone. "You don't understand, people are talking about it everywhere. Martin Kindness Challenge is trending. You've started something." Steven's brow furrowed. "A hashtag?" She nodded eagerly. "Yeah. People all over the world are buying food for the homeless, donating clothes, helping strangers, and all because of what you did yesterday." Steven looked out the window for a long moment. A faint smile crossed his lips. Then maybe the world's not as broken as we think. By evening, news outlets began covering the story. Clips of Steven sitting beside David played across screens with headlines like, "Hollywood star helps homeless man and changes his life." Steven Seagal sparks global kindness movement. Meanwhile, David returned to the overpass, and not to sleep, but to say goodbye to the place that had been his home for too long. He gathered his few belongings into the duffel bag, took one last look, and whispered, "This chapter's over." That night, he checked into a small hostel using some of the money Steven had given him. For the first time in years, he lay in a real bed, clean sheets beneath him, a roof over his head. He stared at the ceiling and smiled. On the nightstand was the envelope from Steven. Inside, along with the money, was a handwritten note. "This isn't charity. It's a reminder that one small act of courage can change your story. S." David read it again and again, his chest tight with emotion. Then he pulled out an old notebook he'd found, and on the first page he wrote 5 words. "Tomorrow, I start my life." He didn't know that by morning. His story I would be everywhere. The viral video had reached millions. People from all corners of the world commented, faith in humanity restored. Some even began searching for David, wanting to help him find his daughter. For the first time in a decade, David's name wasn't just a name whispered on the streets, and it was a symbol of hope. And somewhere, Steven Seagal smiled quietly, knowing that sometimes the smallest spark can light up the darkest night. Do you believe one small act of kindness can change a person's life forever? Type yes if you do, and share this story to remind the world that hope still exists. By morning, the city was buzzing. Phones vibrated with notifications, timelines filled with one story. Hollywood legend Steven Seagal helps homeless man get his life back. Clips of Steven sitting on the sidewalk, handing over the duffel bag, and walking beside David were everywhere, on TikTok, YouTube, and news channels around the globe. People were calling it the kindness ripple. In one viral clip, a reporter's voice said, "In a world where fame often blinds compassion, one man chose humility over headlines. And now his act of kindness is inspiring millions." David woke up in his hostel room rubbing his eyes. He had no idea how famous he'd become overnight. When he opened his phone, an old, cracked one he'd kept for emergencies. It was buzzing nonstop with messages from unknown numbers and social media tags. He scrolled through the endless notifications, confusion washing over him. Then he saw his own face, freshly shaved, wearing his new jacket, on every platform. Underneath, the captions read, "Meet David, a proof that one good deed can change a life." He froze. This can't be real," he whispered. Moments later, there was a knock at his door. It was the hostel manager. "David? There's someone downstairs asking for you." David frowned, his mind racing. "Who?" The manager smiled faintly. "You'll want to see for yourself." He walked down the steps, his heart pounding. When he reached the lobby, he stopped in his tracks. A young woman stood there, eyes wide, hands trembling. "Dad?" she whispered. David's breath caught. His mind went blank. The voice. It couldn't be. His eyes filled with tears as he took a step closer. "Emily?" he said, his voice cracking. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I saw you on the internet. I couldn't believe it. I thought you were gone." He covered his mouth, overwhelmed. The years melted away in an instant. All the pain, regret, and loneliness. You found me? I had to, she said, running into his arms. Mom showed me the video. I couldn't stop crying. You looked happy again. David held her tightly, his body shaking. I'm so sorry, he whispered. For everything, for disappearing, for not being there. Emily pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. You don't have to apologize. You're here now, that's what matters. They stood there, crying, laughing, holding on to each other like time itself had paused. People in the lobby clapped softly, some wiping their own tears. After a few moments, Emily said, Steven Seagal changed your life, Dad. Do you think we could thank him in person? David smiled through his tears. I think he'd like that. Later that day, Steven sat in a quiet cafe away from the chaos of the viral storm. He sipped his tea, watching news anchors debate his intentions. Some called it a PR stunt. Others called it pure compassion. He didn't care either way. He hadn't done it for cameras, he'd done it for David. Just then the door opened and a familiar voice said, Mr. Seagal? Steven looked up. David stood there, clean, confident, and smiling, with a young woman beside him. Well, Steven said, standing up with a grin. You clean up pretty good, my friend. David chuckled. I had a good reason to. He turned toward Emily. This is my daughter, Emily. She found me because of you. Steven's eyes softened. That's the best thing I've heard all week. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. Thank you, Mr. Seagal. You didn't just change his life, you gave me my father back. Steven smiled gently. You don't need to thank me. He did the hard part and he chose to start again. David nodded. Maybe, but I wouldn't have had the courage without you. Steven placed a hand on David's shoulder. The courage was always there. I just helped you see it. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, a living testament to how one small act of kindness could change the course of lives. As they sat down to talk, people around the cafe started recognizing them. Phones came out. Cameras flashed. But this time, Steven didn't shy away. He turned toward one of the nearby cameras and said calmly, If you're watching this, remember, kindness doesn't need an audience. It just needs a heart. The world doesn't change with speeches. It changes with small actions, one person at a time. His words spread across the internet once again, igniting another wave of emotion. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Steven, David, and Emily walked outside together. The air was cool, the city lights flickering around them. David turned to Steven and said softly, You know, when I asked you for $1, I thought you'd just walk away. Steven smiled faintly. And if I had, I never would have met a good man, or helped bring a family back together. Emily slipped her arm through her father's. You changed more than one life. Mr. Seagal. Steven looked up at the darkening sky, his voice calm and grounded. No, he said. He changed his own. I just reminded him he could. As they said goodbye, David felt something inside him he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real, lasting peace. Steven watched them walk away, a faint smile on his face. He didn't need applause or praise or headlines. The true reward was right in front of him. A man reborn, a daughter reunited, a message spreading across the world. If you believe in second chances and the power of forgiveness, type hope in the comments and share this story to remind others that kindness still wins. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. What started as a quiet moment on a lonely street had turned into a movement that stretched across countries and continents. The hashtag #CheerKindnessRipple had reached over 100 million views worldwide. People were sharing their own stories, buying food for strangers, helping the elderly, donating to shelters, reconnecting with family members they hadn't spoken to in years. And at the center of it all was David. He was no longer the man who slept beneath an overpass. He now worked full-time at Carl's garage, showing up early every morning, smiling like someone who'd finally remembered who he was. His hands were once again stained with grease, but this time they symbolized dignity, not despair. Customers loved him. His coworkers admired him, and every night before leaving, he would look in the mirror by the door and whisper, "Thank you, Steven." But the story didn't end there. One morning, as David arrived at work, A news van was parked outside. The reporter stepped out with a friendly grin. "David, you've got a moment?" David laughed nervously. "I thought my 15 minutes of fame were over." "Not yet," the reporter said. "We're filming a follow-up. The world wants to know how you're doing, and what message you have for everyone who saw your story." David hesitated, then smiled. "Sure," he said softly. "Let's do it." A few minutes later, the cameras were rolling. The interviewer asked, "David, millions of people were touched by Steven Seagal's kindness. How has your life changed since that day?" David looked down for a moment, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything changed, but not because of money or fame. It changed because someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He looked straight into the camera. "If you're watching this and you've given up, don't. One act of kindness, one small moment of courage can turn your whole story around." "I'm living proof," the reporter smiled. "Beautifully said." That clip went viral again, but this time it wasn't about Steven. It was about hope. Meanwhile, Steven watched the interview from his living room. He smiled faintly, sipping tea as David's words filled the screen. "He found his voice," Steven murmured. "That's all he ever needed." A few days later, Steven was invited to speak at a charity event for homelessness awareness. The organizers asked him to share his story, the story that started it all. Standing on stage under soft lights, Steven looked out at the audience of hundreds. Cameras flashed, journalists waited with their pens poised, but his voice was calm, grounded, real. "We live in a world that teaches us to look away," he said, "to walk past the broken, the forgotten, the invisible. But the truth is, none of us are invisible. Every life you touch, every hand you hold, every heart you remind to keep beating. That's how we make the world better." The crowd fell silent. His words hung heavy in the air. "David didn't need a hero," Steven continued. "He just needed a reminder that he mattered. That's what kindness does. It tells someone, you matter. And that's something all of us can give." When he finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was long, genuine, and filled with emotion. But Steven didn't smile for the cameras or wave dramatically. He simply nodded, humble, grounded, at peace. That night, when the event ended, Steven stepped outside into the cool air. A little boy approached him with his mother holding a small paper note. "Mr. Seagal," the boy said shyly, "I helped a homeless man today. I gave him food." "Because you did it first." Steven knelt down, smiling warmly. "Then you've already made the world better, kid." The boy grinned. "Will you keep helping people too?" Steven chuckled softly. "That's the plan." As the boy ran back to his mother, Steven looked up at the night sky. The city lights shimmered and he whispered, "One act, that's all it takes." And somewhere across town, David was sitting at a small dinner table with his daughter, laughing. The sound of two lives healed by a single moment of compassion. If you believe kindness still has power in this world, type respect in the comments. And share this story so the ripple of compassion never ends.